Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 8, Day 1. Today I'd like for you to answer this question for your journal, and remember we are starting a brand new journal, so please make sure you're starting that along with us. What are some of the lasting problems from Unit 7 that we will continue facing in Unit 8? All right, from big business to Native Americans to um, economic problems, what are some issues that could potentially be long lasting in this upcoming unit and period? Now, we're going to cover a little bit of information that kind of goes back into the Gilded Age a little bit, but we'll kind of start moving into the early 1900s and getting on into the Progressive Era. Now, our essential question for the day: what were the effects of immigration on the United States, and what laws influenced the immigrants from the Atlantic versus the Pacific? Now, our 25th president, William McKinley, was assassinated in 1901 by Leon Czolgosz. And because of this, it created mass hysteria throughout the country of people with basically odd names and foreign people. And McKinley's death is going to continue to affect immigration for years to come. But now people had this gigantic fear of someone who had just like if you want to say a Southern European name or something like that. You could almost go towards the countries towards the Middle East, but the Middle East didn't exist then, not as we know it now. Now, people were on the move during this time. In 1865, the population was roughly 31.5 million. Between 1865 and 1920, close to 30 million additional people entered the country. Most were traveling by boat, but they could not afford like an actual ticket, so they were coming in steerage. That's like the cargo hold. And immigrants mostly came through New York. And when I say New York, I mean New York City. And because so many people came through this area as a way of immigration, it became known as the Golden Door. And so in 1892, the United States took it upon themselves to open Ellis Island. And Ellis Island was used to basically sort through immigrants, make sure they were fit for immigration, that they weren't bringing a disease, things of that nature. And you can see a picture of Ellis Island today. It's still there, but mostly used for tours now. And it was put right below the Statue of Liberty, which was given to us by France. And because of this, the Statue of Liberty becomes a world symbol that the United States is a place of refuge and hope. Now, for immigrants, the origin was often misidentified when they arrived at Ellis Island. Accurate numbers were not kept way up until the early 1900s. It's estimated that about 10 million immigrants arrived in the 30-year period after the Civil War, mostly English and Germans, and this did not include any Mexican immigrants. They were not counted until like 1910 or 1905, somewhere in there. In the 1890s, immigration shifted dramatically. Between 1890 and 1920, about 10 million Italians, Greeks, Slavs, Eastern Europeans, and Russian Jews and Armenians arrived. So a lot of those groups of people with funny names that we're talking about, okay, like Leon Czolgosz. And there's a couple questions I want you to think about. Why are immigrants leaving their country? Number one, what problems are immigrants facing? And then the last question, what special problem are Asian immigrants facing? Okay, and we'll talk more about Asian immigrants here in just a second. Now, in the 1880s, states made decisions about immigration, so it was state to state whether someone was allowed to immigrate, etc. In 1891, the federal government finally created the Office of the Superintendent of Immigration, and their basic job was to determine who was fit for life. Now, immigrants with diseases were often quarantined or deported immediately, so they were sent back. And there were multiple problems with this because many of these immigrants actually sold everything they had in order to come to America in the first place. So by being shipped back to their home country, they went back to nothing. They had nothing to go back to. There was no place for them. There was no home for them. Now, some reasons that most immigrants did not get off the boat or were not allowed to come in was tuberculosis was a huge one, trachoma, which was an eye disease, and if your child was sick, generally that meant either you could go ahead and come in as a parent, but your child's going back, which obviously you're not going to do, which oftentimes meant that families were split up. So, a husband may have to go back with the kid, with that kid, while, let's say you had two kids, wife and other child stays there. Immigrants also faced many problems when they arrived with crooks, those people who would take advantage of them. So many immigrants ended up settling near ports, train hubs, and anywhere they could find a job, basically. Employers also took advantage of these immigrants because they realized that they were new to the country and they knew that they could work them hard because they didn't have the same outlook necessarily, or expectations, or reputations that someone who had already lived here. Fiorello LaGuardia made this statement: sometimes, if it was a young child who suffered from trachoma, one of the parents had to return to the native country with a rejected member of the family. When they learned their fate, they were stunned. They had no homes to return to. And LaGuardia's, the airport is named after him in New York, but he made this famous statement talking about immigration and how hard it was for New York, or for those who immigrated into New York. And it's not going to get much easier for immigrants through the next period of years either. Chinese immigrants are also facing special issues because of their work on the railroad. Many had immigrated in the West and had become, indentured servants basically to the railroads. They gained the nickname coolies, and this was a derogatory term that referred to just Chinese people that were working on the railroad. Many had worked their way out of their contracts and had began, creating their own farms, and had worked, began working in other fields as well. The group as a whole had difficulty with these stereotypes, though. The way they dressed, their long ponytails, which is called the queue, which comes from Chinese beliefs about, that's where their honor is. And so, leading up to this, or leading up to that event, is the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1892. And what it did is it prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country. And our country is actually going to renew this for the next 10 years. And it's going to be permanent after 1902 until 1943. So all the way up until after World War II is the Chinese Exclusion Act going to be in place. And essentially it said that if you were Chinese and you were coming into this country in order to work, in order to make money, you could not come. In 1910, the government built a detention center. Unlike Ellis Island, Angel Island was for the review of immigrant claims from the West, but it was more of a, keeping the Chinese and Japanese out. Now, that gets us to the Japanese. In 1920, Japanese immigrants had started arriving on the West Coast, and some had arrived obviously before this period of time. Some had arrived in Hawaii as early as the 1890s. It was called the Yellow Peril, which was a derogatory name given to the Japanese workers out of jealousy that, these Japanese workers are coming in trying to take jobs. And if you think historically, guys, we've had periods in our country where this has also been the same thing. If you think back to Hispanic workers, 15, 20 years ago, there was a very huge, and there still is in some way, there were large groups of people who looked derogatory towards immigrants from Mexico, or really any country, because many times immigrants would take the jobs that, either quote unquote Americans wanted, and even though they didn't take the job, they still didn't want somebody else taking the job. So it's ridiculous, but a lot of times immigrants will work the jobs that citizens almost find themselves too good for, which generally ends up being hard labor, manual labor, etc. In 1905, California's political leaders began passing restrictions on Japanese immigrants. In 1913, they even passed an alien land law that banned Asians who were not citizens. They could not own farmland. And you see a lot of these kinds of restrictions continuing to grow, that it became more important that you had to be a citizen in order to be in our country, and to be in America, and to live and operate. In 1921, the Immigration Restriction Act was put into place, which limited immigration from not only Asia but Europe, and essentially made it to where Mexican immigrants were needed more than ever for labor. And a lot of times you needed those Mexican immigrants to come in and work, because you lost a lot of that cheap labor force that you were getting from Europe and Asia. And it's important to note that Mexican immigrants are going to be a very, very huge source of labor, and kind of the central focus of a lot of arguments for labor issues up until the 1960s and 70s. Now, the challenge of cities, we're kind of going to switch gears here and just talk about kind of life in the city during this time. People in the late 1800s had began moving outside of the cities into suburbs. You had cable cars, electric trolleys, elevated trains, automobiles, subways. All these things are making life expand, and because of this, you're seeing people move out into these suburban areas, and being able to create suburbs where they can get back to their jobs in the city, then leave the city and go back home. Urban living conditions were very poor, though, despite the fact that Carnegie still was expanding the city. Many times, a lot of these areas in the city were very poor, and there's no toilets, lots of diseases, fires were rampant, no fire codes, things of that nature. We make jokes about fire marshals coming around and telling us what to do here at school. But the reality of it is there were no real fire marshals. They didn't have all these codes and things that you couldn't do in your home. And the other thing that developed in these cities are ghettos, and ghettos were just sections of cities in which certain ethnic or racial groups lived. And with so many immigrants coming in, especially into New York, you had a lot of times that not only I think a lot of times we associate a ghetto area with poor people, but the reason that is because a lot of times these ghettos were where immigrants came in that didn't have very much money or they didn't have it. They didn't have anything at all because they'd sold everything to even just to get to America to try to create a new life for themselves. And then on top of that, you also had these covenants among what I'm going to call white groups because that was mostly your bigger business owners, where a lot of more of your money was. African Americans are beginning to shift that some in society, but a lot of times the mass majority of the economic um, value is still in the hands of a lot of white people. And so they created these covenants, which were basically the restrictions on sale and rental of certain property by certain groups. So if I create a community, put that simply, if I had a community and I was living in it, land or rental property could not be rented or sold to someone of a particular race or of a certain group. You're also going to see the rise of political bosses with the development of cities. Political machines formed, and they were these unofficial organizations that were designed to keep particular parties out and a particular group in power. And what they did is they used a single powerful political boss in the city, and he presided over the machine. And the machine is all that is just a group of people that are either paying money or doing favors in order to keep people in political office to make sure they get reelected, and then they, once are elected, do favors for the political machine. And these officers are generally handpicked, and the machine helps them win. One of the largest political machines was Tammany Hall in New York City, and it was ran by William Marcy Tweed. And they had amassed huge amounts of money through fraud. They had ripped off various companies and government officials that had helped them rip off by taking advantage of different situations. And Tweed was brought down in 1873 by a German immigrant of all things, Thomas Nast, who actually published political cartoons that exposed all the evil and corrupt political practices going on in New York City. Unfortunately, though, Tammany Hall and its politics are going to dominate New York City for over a half a century. All right, here is your vocabulary for the day, and once again, we're starting a new vocabulary list, so please make sure you get all these words down. You don't have any questions for today, just make sure you get your vocabulary down, and we'll keep rocking and rolling on day 2 next time. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon.